Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Cliff. Really excited to talk about your journey and what you're building with Cream Co Meats. And it's really a lot of really cool conversations around food the last month or two. Had a lot of cool guests on talking about sort of the future of food. And before we start to talk about Cream Co, let's talk about your journey a little bit before you founded the company.
Yeah, definitely. Glad to be here. So yeah, before Creamco, I kind of entered into the food industry by way of the culinary industry. So I went to culinary school, was classically trained, worked professionally in the Bay Area for a number of years, and kind of had that classic line cook story where you're, working the long hours, you have the fun lifestyle, but you're kind of like, what's next? Like, where do we go from here? So I was looking for new opportunities in food. I love being in food, love working in food, but didn't necessarily want to close down the line at 1 a.m. Kind of stumbled into sustainable meats via this small one of the first farm direct aggregators in the Bay Area called Pray the Ranch Meat Company, and joined them. They were like a farmers market company. They were networking with farms around California, bringing those products to the farmers market. And kind of stumbled into the industry via Pray the Ranch Meat Company, and worked there for quite a long time, kind of learned the industry from the grass up, met with a lot of producers and farmers, work with chefs and butchered products and value-added products. And that was really kind of my entry into the space, was a very organic way of getting into it.
I guess for those who don't know, starting from where you started and kind of where you are now, I guess what kind of insight can you give to sort of people who don't understand maybe the commoditized meat sort of sector and maybe traditionally what it's like to sort of factory farm of meat versus now we're seeing more and more companies go to, sustainable meat, regenerative meat even, and sort of this new landscape of what things once were to what they are becoming now. But give us an idea a little bit of like currently what the conditions are like for the production of meat at mass scale.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And so much of kind of like the new age terms, sustainable, regenerative, et cetera, is really kind of going back to the way things were before everything was industrialized. And so now we're qualifying it differently, but really it's kind of like a return to the old ways. And I think it was really kind of around World War I, World War II, and even prior to that, but in a serious way around the world wars, that we really started to industrialize food production in America. And it was really kind of a product of like weaponizing food, being able to produce food as like quickly, as efficiently as possible. And a lot of that, was centralized and industrialized. It was built around crops that we could quickly grow, high energy crops that we could get out to our animals to feed them. And so we created this system where we were able to produce a lot of food, but it was relatively low quality food. And that's kind of where we're at today with these mass industrialized, centralized systems of food production, whether it's, corn or soy or beef and pork. We've built this factory farming system where we've prioritized speed of production above everything else, speed and cost of production above everything else. And we've ended up with these foods that are really pretty bad for you, pretty bad for the environment, bad for the animals. And we're kind of seeing that backlash. We're seeing the trends start to shift the other direction now.
I guess when you sort of made the transition from, working for a company, seeing what the industry's like from the grass up, like you said, love that phrase. What made you decide to start Creamco, and maybe tell us a little bit about what it is and sort of the mission of it?
Yeah, so our mission is to create new opportunities for people to enjoy meat responsibly. So that's a pretty simple mission, and we're doing that by creating a platform for access. And it's really about access. It's moving away from these centralized models to a decentralized regional food hub model. So it's access not only for the consumers, but also access to the infrastructure for producers, for ranchers and farmers. So that's really what we're trying to do, is kind of decentralize our food system and bring it back into our regional marketplaces so that anybody can get involved. Any small rancher with 50 acres of land, 10 acres of land could start to contribute and produce and create a more resilient food ecosystem for their local area and beyond. And that's really kind of what we see as being the future of food are these more decentralized regional food hubs that are servicing their community, not only from a food point of view, but also creating jobs and just creating more equity in their communities.
How Creamco works a little bit is that you create relationship with sort of local ranchers, family farms, and you go direct to them and you buy wholesale from them essentially, and then you sort of sell it online. Is that a little bit how it works?
Yeah, so we have a variety of ways in which we work with producers. I mean, some of our ranching partners are, pretty established. They've been in the marketplace for a long time. But a lot of our ranching partners are just trying to figure it out. They're trying, like they have the land resource, they have the ability to raise animals, but they don't have access to the marketplace, or they don't know what they should do with their land. And that's really our specialty, is like finding these really interesting landowners or land managers who want to do better with their land. They want to convert from like old conventional systems towards a more sustainable and regenerative system. And maybe they've, already started that journey a little bit, or maybe they're right at the beginning of that journey. A really good example of that this year is with PT Ranch, which is a family owned and operated ranch. It's a little bit outside of Lodi, California. And they kind of already started their journey to move towards regenerative, but they're trying to figure out how to generate more revenue from their land. Like, where do they go from here, right? Like, they want to employ these better practices. They want to raise animals correctly, but they need to find partnerships or access to a marketplace to be able to do it at scale so that it makes economic sense. So it was a perfect opportunity for Creamco and PT to partner up and throw some serious scale behind an animal product coming off of their farm. So we launched the first ecological outcome verified pasture-raised turkey with them this year in California, which is a regenerative certification. And they were able to raise 2,000 turkeys for us to sell through our wholesale and direct-to-consumer channels. And so that's a big boon for the farmer, because they're able to really put their land to work and generate a really strong revenue pipeline from that. And it's great for our consumers because they get to enjoy something that's completely unique and interesting. And it's also having a regenerative net positive impact on the land.
When when we say we go to our sort of local grocery stores, are the suppliers of the meat normally in grocery stores not sort of local farms and ranches that you have partnered with? Is that sort of different?
The majority of the meat that you're going to find in the marketplace really is coming from more commodity and conventional producers. So, you're not seeing a ton of local products in your kind of like larger regional big box grocery store chains. Maybe there's some, but there's not a lot. Then, we kind of talk about the meat industry. We call it the spectrum of sustainability. And on one end, you have, commodity, which is like the worst of the worst. Right. Animals are being treated wrong. They're eating the wrong diet. On the other end, you have like your lonely Sonoma County rancher that has like 10 head of cattle, but they're the most amazing, most beautiful head of cattle you've ever seen.
Right.
So Creamco,
the Gucci of meat, if you will.
The Gucci of meat. Yeah. Like the unrealistic, but idealistic, like version of what everybody thinks that they want to eat and should be eating. Right. So, we really operate in that middle point, which is the never ever point. So that means that like no antibiotics, no hormones are ever used in our animal production whatsoever, and up. So we don't touch commodity or conventional products whatsoever. And that's pretty rare. And from that natural point and up, if you're like taking a step back and looking at the greater industry, that makes a very small percentage of the meat that's actually out there and available in the marketplace. The vast majority is commodity and conventional products where they are using hormones, antibiotics, and doing all other types of inhumane things to those animals to produce them.
It's not just the inhumane sort of like practices, but there seems like there'd be a health component to it as well for us as, a species, to all this sort of the hormones and everything sort of being put into our meat that we consume. It seems like that hasn't been really spoken about, I guess, enough, because we I don't know, I guess looking at the organic part of it is, and the GMO part of it is a really much more bigger deal, not only for quality, right, and taste and the humane part, but also from a health point of view. I wish that was, I guess, like expressed more. right, in the industry of like how healthy meat should be versus like how it's not, right? Because it's so commoditized, it almost has become like a snack, right? Like it's like it's probably like something you eat every day now. Like people, like that's how
Oh
we've been
yeah.
trained, which is not how, right?
No,
It's
yeah.
almost should be the luxury is when you eat meat, right? It's maybe once a week or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we're not so far away from our genetic like hunter-gatherer cousins, Like it's not meat should not be an everyday part of your diet. It really should be eaten, less frequently. And we've definitely moved into this diet style where I think that the vast majority, especially of Americans, have meat as a part of their diet almost daily. And typically that meat is unhealthy meat. So yeah, I mean, the nutritional aspects I think are critical as well. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And you are what you eat, and what you're eating is what it eats, right? So like it goes down
Yeah.
the chain. If you're eating an animal that was solely eating, non-nutritional grains its entire life to get fat as quickly as possible, well, you're just kind of extending that into your own diet once you sit down to eat a steak from an animal that was produced that way.
When you talk to like ranchers and farmers, are they on like their second, third, fourth generation, maybe even, or is it new farmers or ranchers coming into these lands and trying to figure out a way to make them more organic and regenerative? Or is it still the families that have been there for so long trying to sort of reinvent their land?
It's really a mix. We definitely see like legacy ranchers and families, and we work with a number of them. And we have a fair amount of kind of like young up and coming individuals who are just trying to, figure out a alternative to the 9 to 5, like metropolitan grind, and want to do something different with their lives. So we do see a mix. I would say, getting into ranching can be pretty cost prohibitive. It obviously requires a lot of land resource.
Right.
So we do tend to see, ranchers that have been doing it for a while, or their families have been doing it for a while. But I think what's really cool is kind of working with those old school families, whether it's still that like older generation that's working that land and trying to figure out what to do better with it, or it's like the younger generation that is taking it over from their, mother or father, and they're way more concerned about environmental outcomes and impact. And they're looking at this, 1,200-acre property and saying, how can we do this better? Like, what can we do differently about, the management of this land this time around, now that it's kind of passing generations, and try to have this net positive impact.
You mentioned land to market before. The first sort of turkey is sort of labeled that way.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? Like how do we define sort of what that is, and why is that different? And maybe what makes it important, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. It's really this kind of movement towards regenerative agriculture at large that's really interesting. And again, it's kind of like a new term, and it really is reflective on how we used to manage our lands. That used to be the standard, was regenerative agriculture, because you were trying to get the most out of your land and you wanted it to be as healthy as possible. And you weren't, row cropping and like pounding your soil with fertilizers to force it to raise your next harvest of the same crop. You were trying to manage a biodynamic, piece of property where you could raise, tomatoes during one season and kale at a different season, and then run your animals through your fields and naturally till them. But the regenerative, like land to market EOV certification, that really is a process of measuring the impact, the positive impact that you're having on your land through the management of your land. And so what that certification is doing is it's measuring the organic matter that is in your soil, and it's measuring it at the same place, in the same place, over a period of 5 years and longer. So they're actually able to tell whether or not your practices are improving your soil's organic matter. And then there's a lot of net positive impact if you are improving the organic matter that comes out of that.
I want to talk about scale a little bit, and how you sort of can scale regenerative, right? And maybe the model that you're looking at right now. is this model sort of scalable, right? And how is that done? How can we, you mentioned access earlier, how can more people have access to this type of food, right? And how do we make it somewhat affordable? Anytime you do anything like the right way, it's going to be more expensive than a commoditized, factory way, right? That's just is what it is. Healthy.
Part of the deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but how do we at least scale it? How do we get to a point where those things come together and it is fairly affordable and it's accessible for the masses, right? So where this is much more the norm.
Yeah, I think there's a number of paths that can lead to a more scalable system and more affordable food, et cetera. We really believe in this decentralized model, right? So kind of like bringing food production back to your regional communities and kind of investing in the infrastructure that allows for there to be these micro regional food hubs that are feeding their direct communities. Versus this industrialized, centralized model. But I think that, the reason why food is so cheap in America is because of the subsidies. And so
Right.
we're subsidizing this style of food production, this industrialized GMO style of food production at a very, very high level. So if we switch those subsidies around and start to prioritize and subsidize this other style of food production, this regenerative style of food production, a more sustainable style of food production, then all of a sudden we're getting our regional communities involved with their own food production, but also the subsidies that go along with that.
Yeah, that's interesting because we sort of subsidize unhealthy foods at scale, really.
At scale, we do, yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's a big part of what allows those industries to be so successful are the subsidies. Without the subsidies, those foods would not be so cheap.
Well, and we always talk about ancillary effects, right? When you subsidize unhealthy food, you scale illness and sickness and unhealthy individuals, which then, healthcare costs go way up, right? And nobody wants to really, there's such a divide with universal healthcare, and we might not even need to go down that route if we subsidize more healthier food. Overall, less people would get sick, cost of healthcare will go down. I mean, obviously that's a simple way to put it, but at scale, you equalizes a lot less sick people. You add more healthy people to a population, healthcare costs will probably go down. Do you talk to legislators at all, whether it's California or other states, or even just locally, right? Whether it's a region, about legislation for subsidies for regenerative products or organic?
We don't directly, but there's so many nonprofits that we interact with that are trying to get those policies into our local governments and even to our federal systems. And those are really kind of our voice, that those nonprofits and other entities that are really trying to make a difference at that level. Yeah, I mean, it's really important that they are doing that work as well as it does support all of the work that we're doing within the regional food systems.
You talked about these regional food hubs. How is that duplicatable within regions, right? You mentioned your sort of Bay Area, Oakland, California, but like, what does it look like if somebody in, Iowa wants to do this, right? Or somebody in Louisiana or, Kansas or something like that? Like, what does it look like is Creamco looking at that? It's like, hey, how can we duplicate our model into different regions around the country, or even spread it out to California more?
Yeah, definitely. We definitely are. So I mean, in our 2022 plan is kind of to bring this model to Southern California, and after that, we're looking at different areas within the country as well. And so, like the Creamco model, for instance, is like the cream of the crop, right? We're not trying to race at the bottom. We're not trying to be the biggest meat company, meat processor in the area. We're trying to work with these really great regional producers and aggregate them and then give them access to bigger marketplaces, kind of bridge the gap between farm direct quality and broadline efficiency of distribution, and again, create that access. But I think it's very, it's very scalable. We just have to invest. I mean, it definitely needs more investment. We can't allow, 4 companies to dominate 80% of America's meat production. We need to kind of, again, decentralize how we approach these problems, and so that we're not so reliant on so few to feed the world.
When you're talking about getting these sort of regional hubs up and going, is that just getting 5 or 6 ranches or farms involved, or sign on the dotted line, whatever it may be, get them in a partnership for this to occur? Like, what does it look like to have these hubs sort of pop up?
I think it kind of, a lot of this infrastructure is out there, right? A lot of like
Mm-hmm.
the USDA, the old USDA infrastructure still exists. It's in disrepair. It needs investment. It needs to kind of get gussied up and get new tools and retooling to be able to handle network of further processors, co-packers like Creamco, and reinvesting in those entities and building them back up. That's what's going to allow for regional food producers to have more access and a more competitive marketplace for them to go to get their products harvested and out into the marketplace. And so that's really where what needs to happen. That's the next step, is just a reinvestment in the infrastructure of old, to kind of create these hubs. Until we do that, it's going to be very difficult. The large players, the industrial like slaughterhouses that are harvesting 2,000, 3,000 head of cattle a day, they literally cannot work with a small producer that is harvesting 10 head of cattle every other week or 10 head of cattle a month. They just don't have the tooling to do that. It's massively inefficient because these plants have been built from the ground up to harvest 2,000, 3,000 head of cattle. And so if that's all that we're left with, then the only players that are going to be able to participate are going to be these large industrialized players. It's really about reinvesting into our smaller food hubs. That's the first step in creating a more resilient, decentralized regional marketplace.
And that investment comes from investors, maybe venture capital firms or just private equity, but then also investment from local legislature to maybe subsidize, just like as we subsidize, Teslas, or we now, I think there's a provision in the infrastructure bill where they subsidize electric bikes. There's sort of this subsidizing of EV vehicles or mobility instead of subsidizing, obviously, gas automobiles or something like that. Is there the same? It seems like there would be the same switch needs to be taken, whereas you equate oil and gas to, the old way of farm, slaughterhouses, factory farms, sort of growing with hormones and pesticides. Instead of subsidizing that, subsidize the new regenerative model. That would seem to be a needed investment as well. And also consumers, right? You need the consumers to invest with their dollars, saying we want this in order to scale. So it sounds like all three of those components are needed, perhaps.
Oh yeah,
right?
definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's getting VC involved, private equity, and it's also, I think, like the acknowledgement that this is important. Like that needs to happen. I think as a society, that like eating healthier, to your earlier point, like that's a preventative measure that we could take for the health of the nation. Investing, having kind of like that value proposition be attractive to a VC, to a private equity firm, to have subsidies in place. The USDA actually released a pretty sizable sum of grants for small processors to expand their facilities or upgrade from a state inspected facility to a federally inspected facility. So there is some movement in that space. There's some acknowledgement that this is important. I think definitely in light of how poorly our industrial system failed us during COVID. We saw plants just shutting down like left and right because of the way that they're built in these very kind of dense environments with thousands of people working in them. And the federal government kind of looked up. It's like, like that's dangerous, because if JBS goes down for 2 days,
right,
we've interrupted a massive part of our food supply chain. So there is some acknowledgement that this is important. And there's definitely a lot of reporting out there that, hey, like we have a failing production system. We have a failing decentralized production system. We're too heavily reliant on these industrial players. So there is some acknowledgement, but it's often tough to find investors in the space because we now have a kind of like a VC tech culture of investment where people are expecting like a 20x return on their investments, and in food production, like that's not a realistic kind of return.
Right. I want to talk a little bit. We'll end here a little bit of the future and and kind of maybe what success looks like for you. What does that look like for you and the team, maybe 3 to 5 years down the line? What are some of the successes that you perhaps want to see, or just maybe some of the goals that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, success, I think for us looks like a ever growing network of amazing farmers, just like beautiful farmers with really unique, diverse offerings, unique land that's being managed properly, species being brought to market that have not been seen for a long time, different heritage breeds, different types of rabbits and guineas and pheasants, et cetera, kind of creating just a more diverse landscape to food and really supporting our local ranching communities to raise those animals and feel good about it and be able to make a profit while doing so. So for us, we always kind of approach first and foremost the industry from a culinary point of view and then from an impact point of view. So we're really focused on like, how do we keep food interesting? How do we keep it diverse? Like, how do we keep these heritage breeds at play and not just lose them to commoditized, industrialized players? So if we're able to do that over the next 3 to 5 years, kind of really continue to build out this model and keep things interesting and impactful as we scale, that's going to be success for us.
Well, amazing, man. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's such an interesting topic, and I've been diving deeper into it to understand the supply chains more, understanding what's coming down the line. There's a ton of innovations in food technology. Like you said, I mean, we talk about supply chains a lot. It's how do you build a sustainable, regenerative supply chain from the ground up is essentially the struggle, and what kind of has to be done. They kind of have a monopoly on supply chains.
Yeah,
these big production, these factory farms and these production companies, they straight have a monopoly on the supply chain. So like, unless there's another one created, it's going to be tough to compete. So like we said earlier, I mean, investment from all angles hopefully can come in from private and public capital being injected into, having competition, right? And that what our markets are supposed to be, have competition, but we don't, in this aspect. So
yeah, that's what's healthy. We need more competition. We need less of a monopoly on the system, and through that, it'll be more diverse and just healthier for us and for the planet.
Awesome. Well, best of luck the next year and the next decade to come. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having us.